They thought they had failed. They never saw the system that made their failure certain. I run a printing press on Park Place, and most days the work passes through my hands and disappears. Ink, paper, noise, and then it's gone, out into the city, no longer mine. But for 19 months, something stayed. A name that kept returning. A story that did not arrive all at once, but piece by piece, until I understood, long before most people did, that what we were printing was not just an article. It was a case. I want to tell you something about printing before I tell you anything else. When you hold a magazine in your hands, when you sit by the window on a Tuesday afternoon and turn the pages, when your eye runs down a column and the words go into you and become a thought you carry for the rest of the week, you are holding something that passed through a great many hands before it reached yours. Hands that smell of ink. Hands that are never entirely clean, no matter how long you scrub them at the end of a shift. Hands like mine. My name is Daniel Reeves. In the autumn of 1902, I was 41 years old, and I had been running printing presses for 19 of those years. I started at 17, sweeping floors for a small commercial printer on Fulton Street, and I worked my way up through the trade the way men did in those years, slowly, by demonstration, by showing that you could be trusted with a machine that cost more than your house, more than your father's house, more perhaps than your father had ever imagined a single object could cost. By 1902, I was operating one of the Hoe rotary presses in the press room of McClure's magazine, on the corner of Park Place and Broadway, and I had been there for 6 years. I knew that press room the way a man knows a room he has spent more waking hours in than any other room on earth. I knew where the floor sloped toward the drain in the northeast corner. I knew which feed rollers ran warm in the summer and which stiffened in January. I knew the sound a good press run made, the steady rhythmic thump and exhale of paper being born, a sound I have always thought was not unlike a sleeping breath, if a sleeping breath were made of iron and ink. And I knew the different sound it made when something was about to go wrong. But here's the thing people don't understand about press operators. We read. Not in the way editors read, not with a pencil in hand, making notes, thinking about consequence and revision. We read the way water reads a landscape. We absorb what passes beneath us, and what we absorb leaves a mark, though we couldn't always tell you exactly when it happened or exactly how much had gone in. When you handle a page 100 times over the course of a press run, when you pull sample sheets and check registration and verify ink density and watch for ghost images and paper curl and lateral drift, you read the page. You may not read it as a reader reads, from beginning to end, with the luxury of your attention fully given, but you know what's on it. You know which words repeat. You know which sentences carry weight and which are merely decorative. You know where the argument lives. And so, in the autumn of 1902, I began to notice something, a name that kept coming back. Let me describe the room to you so you can see it. The press room at McClure's occupied the ground floor and part of the basement, in the older wing of the building that fronted Park Place. The floors were wooden, scarred and darkened by decades of use, and they held the vibration of the presses the way a drum holds a note. You felt it in your feet all day, a constant low trembling that became, after a few weeks, indistinguishable from the ordinary sensation of being alive. The ceiling was low enough that a tall man had to mind himself near the press frames, and the windows that faced the street were always slightly gray, filmed with the residue of ink particles that had been suspended in the air of that room for longer than anyone working there could remember. We cleaned them occasionally. They were gray again within a week. There were 4 presses in my time at McClure's. 2 Hoe rotary presses, which handled the main magazine runs, and 2 smaller flatbeds for shorter jobs, inserts, supplements, the occasional special edition. When all 4 were running simultaneously, you could feel the vibration in your back teeth, a sensation somewhere between a hum and a shudder, and you learned very quickly to speak loudly and clearly and to watch a man's face as he spoke rather than relying entirely on your ears. The press room was its own country, with its own language and its own customs and its own unspoken hierarchy, and like all countries, it was easier to understand once you had been living in it for a while. The compositors worked in a separate room adjacent to ours, setting type on linotype machines that made a sound I can only describe as very rapid mechanical knitting, a brisk, intricate clatter that told you, even through the wall, that letters were being assembled into words, and words into lines, and lines into the columns that would eventually become pages. The makeup men worked at the stone. The large, flat-iron tables were the individual galleys, strips of set type in their metal trays, were assembled into complete page forms. The forms were locked tight with furniture and coins, checked for level, and then brought through to us. We set them in the press chases, made our adjustments, and ran. I rarely had occasion to speak at length with the compositors. They were their own guild, with their own union affiliations and their own internal politics and their own sense of where they stood in the trade. There was a respectful distance between the composing room and the press room, the kind of distance that exists between any 2 groups of skilled men who understand each other's work well enough to leave each other alone. We were connected by the forms that passed between us and by not much else. The editors' offices were upstairs. I'd been upstairs perhaps 4 times in 6 years. Once for my initial hiring interview with the production manager, once when there was a question about a press schedule that required me to speak directly with someone in editorial, and twice by accident, having taken the wrong staircase in the early months when I was still learning the building. The editors moved through the upper floors with a different energy than we moved through the lower ones. They were louder in the corridors, quicker in their transitions between rooms, and they wore their clothing in a way that suggested the clothing had never been asked to do anything demanding. They were a different kind of worker. I do not say that as criticism. It is simply the truth. Once in a while, when a story was being rushed through to meet a deadline and a proof needed to be checked before the final run, someone from editorial would come downstairs. It happened rarely. The press room was not their natural environment, and they were never quite comfortable in it. They stood too close to the machines or too far away, and they spoke too quietly, as if they thought the presses might overhear them. But it was one such visit in the late autumn of 1902 that I first heard her name spoken in connection with the work coming through my press.
It was November of 1902, or rather, it was October of 1902, because the November issue is always printed in October. This is one of the fundamental strangeness of working in magazines. The time that reaches the reader is never the time you are living in. The December issue arrives in your press room in November, carrying the smell of a future month. You run it in autumn. It goes out into the world as winter. By the time it is read, the weather has changed. The story that feels current when it reaches a reader in her parlor on a Saturday morning has already been set in type and run and bound and shipped while she was still thinking about other things. I had noticed the name for the first time in late October during a run for the November issue. We were running the main editorial section, the long-form articles that gave McClure's its reputation and its readers. And somewhere in the third form, which I was running on the larger of the 2 Hoe presses, the words Standard Oil appeared in the body of a substantial piece. I noticed them the way your eye notices any familiar phrase in a block of text. A brief snagging, a momentary slowing. Not alarm, simply recognition. Standard Oil. Everyone knew Standard Oil, at least in the way that everyone knows the name of a very large institution without necessarily knowing much about what happens inside it. In 1902, Standard Oil refined somewhere between 80 and 90% of the oil produced in the United States. Its kerosene lit the lamps of 100 million homes. Its name was on the barrel, on the bill, on the delivery wagon. It was not a company so much as a condition of American life, like the railroads or the weather. And like the weather, most people gave it no more thought than was strictly necessary. So I registered the name and moved on. I checked the registration, slightly off on the right margin, perhaps a 32nd of an inch, which I corrected by adjusting the form chase. And I checked the ink density on the halftone photographs, and I looked for the kinds of technical errors that it was my job to catch. A piece about Standard Oil, one of the oil companies. The magazine ran long pieces about companies and industries and men of industry. It was what McClure's did. It was, in some sense, what the whole era did. But I had noticed the name. It had, in the way of things that enter without announcement, gone in. The next month, there was another one.
You have to understand something about how a long investigation looks when it comes through a press room. It does not arrive as a single thing. It does not announce itself. It arrives in pieces, month after month, each installment indistinguishable in format from any other long article the magazine runs, carrying no special mark that says, "This one is different. This one is going somewhere." I did not know, in November of 1902, that what I was printing was the first chapter of something that would run for nearly 2 years. I did not know that a woman named Ida Tarbell had spent the previous 3 years gathering documents and conducting interviews and traveling to Pennsylvania and Ohio and New York, and sitting across tables from men who had spent decades trying to compete against a company that had, in her view, systematically and deliberately made fair competition impossible. I did not know that what I was holding, sample sheet number 4 from the November run, ink density slightly heavy in the left column, registration acceptable, was one small piece of a case being built against the most powerful private corporation in the United States. I just knew there was a piece about Standard Oil. And then, in December, there was another one. And in January, another. By the end of January 1903, I had seen the Standard Oil pages come through the press room 3 times. 3 separate issues, 3 separate press runs, and each time there was the same subject, the same byline at the top. Ida Tarbell. I could not have told you from my position precisely what each installment argued, because I read as I worked, in fragments, in glances, in the 30 seconds between pulling a sample sheet and making an adjustment, in the 2 minutes while a roller was being cleaned. I did not read from beginning to end. I read the way you hear music from another room. You catch phrases, transitions, the shape of the melody, but not every note. But I had begun, without quite deciding to read more carefully when the Standard Oil pages came through. My attention had acquired a new habit. When a form arrived containing those articles, something in me shifted into a slightly different register of alertness. I pulled more sample sheets than the job strictly required. I stood at the press a beat longer before moving on. I let my eye travel further into the columns than was technically necessary for quality control. I was reading. Let me try to describe what I understood, and when I understood it, and how that understanding built itself from pieces. The first article had concerned itself with history, how the Standard Oil Company had come into being, how John D. Rockefeller had started in Cleveland in the years just after the Civil War, how he had grasped, earlier than almost anyone else, that the future of the oil business lay not in drilling, which was unpredictable, expensive, governed by the whims of geology, but in refining, in the processing and the distribution. in controlling the pipe through which the oil moved rather than the ground from which it came. I gathered this from the phrases that passed through my attention in those October press runs. The early refineries of the Cuyahoga Valley, the advantages of consolidation, Cleveland, 1867. The phrases arrived and departed. They meant something without quite meaning anything complete. The second piece, the December installment, which we printed in November, felt different in a way I registered without being able to immediately name. The sentences seemed harder-edged than those in the first article, more compressed. There were words I noticed that carried a specific weight. Rebate, which I had heard in connection with the railroads, but which seemed, in this context, to have a sharper meaning. South Improvement Company, a name I did not know, but which seemed to generate, in the surrounding text, a quality of contained outrage, the way a burn generates heat even after the flame is gone. There was a section I managed to hold long enough to understand its basic shape. In 1872, a group of refiners, Standard Oil among them, had formed a secret arrangement with several railroad companies by which they would receive not merely lower shipping rates than their competitors, but a portion of the rates their competitors paid. They would profit, in other words, from every barrel their enemies shipped. I stood at the press for longer than I should have, reading that section. Then I corrected a slight misalignment in the form and went on. By the third installment in January, I had understood the structure of what was being built. This was not journalism in the sense I had previously encountered journalism coming through a press room, dispatches, columns, opinion. It was something more like the presentation of a legal case. Here are the facts. Here are the documents. Here is what the documents show. Here is what the facts mean, taken together, if you are willing to follow them to their conclusion. That winter, coming in on cold mornings when the press room had not yet fully warmed from the previous day's run, the presses themselves held heat long after they were shut down, and in January you were grateful for it. I began to think about Ida Tarbell. I did not know her. I had never seen her. I knew only what I could deduce from the work, that she was thorough, that she was patient, that she had access to documents that should by rights have been difficult to obtain. The pieces bore no trace of haste. They had the quality of work done over a long time by someone who had decided, at some early point, that she would not move faster than the evidence warranted. I found myself wondering what her office looked like, whether it was orderly or covered in papers, whether she worked in silence or with the sounds of the editorial floor around her, whether she ever thought about what happened to the words once they left her hands. The long journey down through the building, through the compositors and the makeup men and the press operators, the translation from thought into type, into ink, into the 10,000 identical pages now moving through Manhattan on delivery wagons in the cold morning air. Probably she did not think about it. Why would she? Her work was the writing. Our work was the making. They were separate things, separated by 2 floors and the entire vocabulary of a trade. But I thought about her. It was in February of 1903 that I first spoke about the articles to another man in the shop. His name was Lou Ferretti. He was a makeup man, one of the men who worked at the Stone, arranging galleys into the page forms that came through to us. Lou was 31, 10 years younger than me, quick-handed in the way that good makeup men are, with a natural economy of movement that spoke of years of practice. He had a way of talking that made everything sound like a mild complaint, even when he was satisfied, which was a manner I recognized as belonging to a particular kind of working-class New Yorker, one who had learned early that enthusiasm was a form of vulnerability and had decided to be wry instead. We had eaten lunch together perhaps 100 times at the sandwich counter on Barclay Street that we both preferred because it was fast and the coffee was strong. And in those lunches, we had discussed baseball and Tammany Hall and the elevated railway and whether the new linotype machines were eventually going to displace the hand compositors entirely. And we had not once, in any of those lunches, discussed the content of what we printed. That was not what men in our position did. The content belonged to the floors above us. Our concern was the craft, the process, the daily problem of turning materials into product without loss of quality or time. But that February afternoon, I had come through from the press room to check something with the makeup team about a form that had been giving us registration trouble, and Lou was at the stone, assembling what I recognized immediately as the standard oil pages for the March issue. I recognized them the way you recognize a face you have seen many times in a crowd, without ever being formally introduced to the person. A combination of shape and density and proportion that had become, over 4 months, familiar. I stood there a moment longer than the errand required. Lou looked up. "Something wrong with the form?" "No," I said. "It's fine. I was just looking at the piece." He glanced down at the galleys. "More Standard Oil. That's 4 months running now, isn't it?" "3," I said. This would be the 4th. He looked at me with a mild curiosity that held, behind it, something slightly more alert. "You keeping count?" I thought about how to answer. "I notice when the same subject keeps returning," I said finally. It was the most honest answer I could give without explaining more than I was prepared to explain. Lou was quiet for a moment, his hands still moving over the galleys. Then, "My father worked on the railroad, Erie Line, 22 years. He didn't look up. "He could tell you some things about Standard Oil." He didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. But something had passed between us in those 2 sentences, a recognition that the words being assembled on this stone were not abstract, that they had reference in actual lives, that the history being compiled upstairs was connected by real threads to men who had worked railroads and refineries and delivery routes and loading docks across the country, men who had their own versions of whatever story was being told in those columns, men who had never read McClure's and never would. I went back to the press room, but I thought about what Lou had said for the rest of that afternoon and into the evening on the elevated train going home to my rooms on West 30th Street, where my landlady, Mrs. Petricelli, had left a plate covered with a cloth on the kitchen table, and where I ate alone, as I usually did, thinking about railroads and the men who worked them. By the spring of 1903, the Standard Oil articles had become a fixed feature of my working life, as reliable as the monthly production schedule and the bi-weekly roller cleaning and the annual adjustment of the press beds that we did every March when the heating in the building was turned down and the temperature differentials began to affect the metal. They were part of the rhythm. I expected them. When they didn't arrive by a certain point in the month cycle, I noticed their absence. And I had developed, without quite making a decision about it, a practice of reading. Each time the Standard Oil pages came through, I gave myself time with them. Not the whole piece. I was still a press operator with a press to run and quality to maintain, and the work didn't wait. But I had learned, over the previous months, to read while I worked, to hold a paragraph in my eye as I moved around the press, to let a sentence continue in my mind while my hands did their separate task. I had always been able to do this to some degree. Any man who does physical work learns to divide his attention between the hands and the mind, but the Standard Oil articles had given the habit a new intensity. What I was reading, slowly and in pieces, was a portrait of a system. By April, I had begun to understand the rebates in something more than outline. The essential arrangement was this. Standard Oil had negotiated with the major railroad companies, the Erie, the New York Central, the Pennsylvania, to receive secret price reductions on its oil shipments. Not merely lower rates than the published tariff, but lower rates than any competitor could access regardless of the volume they shipped. This alone would have been a substantial advantage, but the arrangement went further. Standard Oil also received a portion of the freight charges paid by its competitors. Every barrel that an independent refiner shipped from Pennsylvania to New York, paying the full published rate, not knowing that others were paying less, contributed a small sum to the Standard Oil treasury. The competitors' costs subsidized Standard Oil's expansion. I thought about this for a long time while I ran a press run one April afternoon. The sky outside the Park Place windows gone the particular yellow-gray of a city spring, and what I thought was, This is not complicated. This is, in fact, very simple. It is simple in the way that a lock is simple. The mechanism is not intricate, but if you do not have the key, you cannot open the door. Standard Oil had the key. More than that, Standard Oil had arranged that the locks on all the doors be changed to fit only the key it held. By summer, the articles had moved on from the railroad arrangements to what Tarbell was calling the petroleum wars of the mid-1870s, the period in which Standard Oil had used its advantages to wage a systematic campaign against the independent refiners of Pennsylvania, driving them one by one into failure or into the Standard fold. The articles named names. They described specific transactions. A refinery in Titusville that had been a profitable operation in 1874 and had sold to Standard Oil in 1876 for a fraction of its worth, the owner having been informed, privately, without documentation, that his shipping costs were about to become untenable. A pipeline company that had been undercut, its customers approached and offered better terms, until it had no traffic and no choice. A group of independent refiners who had attempted, in 1878, to build a direct pipeline to the coast to bypass the railroads entirely, and who had found, at every juncture, that the land rights they needed had been acquired by other parties, that the capital they required was not available, that the equipment they ordered arrived damaged, or not at all. On a Tuesday in July, I stayed late to finish a long run. We were printing a double issue and the schedule had compressed, and ate my supper afterward at the sandwich counter on my own, the other men having gone home hours before. The heat that summer was heavy and sustained, the kind that settles into New York brick and doesn't leave even after dark. Barclay Street smelled of horses and river and the warm electrical smell of the elevated railway. I sat with my coffee and I thought about the independent refiners of Pennsylvania in 1876. I thought about what it must mean to have built something, a business, a refinery, 20 men employed and a family to feed, and a sense of yourself as a man who had made something real out of nothing, and to watch it fail. To watch it fail not because you had made mistakes or lacked ability, but because someone elsewhere had arranged the ground so that your standing on it was already, unknown to you, impossible. I thought about my press, about what I knew of that machine, every valve and roller and impression cylinder, about what it would mean to arrive one morning and find the locks changed. Then I finished my coffee and went home. In August of 1903, Lou Ferretti told me that his uncle had lost a small refinery near Titusville. We were at the sandwich counter again, a Wednesday, the heat of the previous weeks finally beginning to break. Lou had been quieter than usual through the first part of the meal, and I had not pressed it. Lou's quiet was different from other men's quiet, more deliberate, as if he were waiting to make sure of something before he spoke. Eventually, he said, "I've been thinking about those articles." "Which articles?" I asked, though I knew. "The Standard Oil ones, the Tarbell pieces." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "My uncle had a place, near Titusville, maybe 35 men at its height. Good operation, my father always said. Clean plant. He knew what he was doing." He paused. "He sold it in 1878, sold it for almost nothing, a third of what it was worth, my father reckoned, maybe less. Said there was no point going on. I waited. He never explained it more than that, not to my father, not to anyone in the family. He just said the business was finished and he was moving on, and he moved on, and he never spoke of it again. Died in '94. Lou looked up. "My father always thought there was more to the story. He just never knew what it was." The street outside was loud with the usual sounds of late summer in lower Manhattan. Horses and delivery wagons and the distant percussion of construction somewhere on Broadway. I thought about how to answer. I thought about the articles. About 1878, which was precisely the year the petroleum wars had reached their peak, precisely the year Tarbell had described in such detail. The systematic approach, the lowered rates, the private conversations, the offers made, and the consequences of refusal implied but never stated. "Your father was probably right," I said. "There was more to the story." Lou looked at me steadily. Is it in the articles? I can't say for certain about your uncle specifically, but the pattern is there. What happened to operations like his? Yes, it's in the articles. He nodded slowly. He didn't say anything else about it. We talked about the upcoming pennant race. We finished our coffee. But I thought about that conversation for the rest of the week, and I thought about Lou's uncle, a man I had never met who had built something in Pennsylvania and lost it and kept his silence until he died and left the question behind him like an unlabeled box in a locked room. And I thought about the articles, which were, among other things, a systematic attempt to open those rooms, to label those boxes, to give the silence a shape. I should tell you something about my life outside the press room, because I've been speaking as if the press room were the whole of it, and it was not. I lived in a 2-room apartment on West 30th Street, on the 3rd floor of a building owned by a Sicilian family named Petrocelli, whose patriarch had come to New York in 1881, and who now occupied the ground floor and rented the upper floors to working men of generally quiet habits. My apartment had one window that faced the street and one that faced the building's interior courtyard, where there was a fig tree that Mrs. Petrocelli maintained with considerable devotion. In summer, the fig tree produced fruit. In winter, it stood bare and slightly formal, like a dignified person waiting for better weather. I was not married. I had been, briefly, in my early 30s. A woman named Clara, who had come from the same part of upstate New York as my mother, and who had been kind and straightforward, and had died of typhoid in the summer of 1895, before we had had children, before we had done more than begin the ordinary architecture of a shared life. I did not discuss Clara with the men at work. It was not the kind of thing that was discussed. But she was present in my rooms the way all absences are present, in the small accommodations you have stopped making, the particular quality of a silence that knows it is not temporary. In the evenings, I read. I had always been a reader. It was perhaps why I had been drawn to the printing trade in the first place. Or perhaps the trade had deepened the habit. I was no longer sure which had come first. I had a shelf of books above the small table where I ate. Some history, some biography, a novel or two, the complete works of a man named Thorstein Veblen, whose arguments about the nature of economic competition I had been working through slowly for 2 years, and understanding perhaps a third of, which I felt was probably enough. In the autumn of 1903, I began doing something I had not done before. I began going to the public library on a Saturday afternoon and reading the back issues of McClure's. This sounds simple, but it was, for me, a significant act. I was, for the first time, reading Tarbell's articles as a reader reads them, from beginning to end, in sequence, with my full attention and the leisure of a Saturday afternoon, and no press running beside me. I was reading what I had been printing, and the experience of reading what you have printed, when the printing itself has made you already half familiar with the material, is unlike any other reading experience I can describe. It was like hearing a piece of music you have heard through a wall for months, finally played in the same room as you. The structure was suddenly legible. The architecture stood revealed. I went back 5 weeks in a row. I read every installment from the beginning. And by the end of those 5 Saturdays, I understood something I had only partially understood before. This was going to matter. Not in some abstract journalistic sense of making a difference, in a specific, legal, institutional sense. The evidence being assembled in these pages was the kind of evidence that courts required. The documentation Tarbell had gathered, the railroad contracts, the shipping records, the testimony of the independent oil men who had agreed to speak, was the kind of documentation that could not be dismissed as opinion or exaggeration. It was fact. Verifiable, sourced, specific fact. And it was being read by 100,000 people. I walked home from the library on those October afternoons through streets that were beginning to smell of autumn, of coal smoke and turning leaves,
and I thought about what it meant to print something true. By the time autumn 1903 arrived, I had been living with the Standard Oil investigation for nearly a year. I want to try to describe what that was like, because it was unlike anything I had previously experienced in my working life, and I think the experience is worth describing carefully. I had printed a great many things in 19 years. I had printed news of the Spanish-American War, the sinking of the Maine, the charge at San Juan Hill, the terms of the peace. I had printed the announcement of McKinley's election and the announcement of his assassination 2 years after. I had printed accounts of the Johnstown flood and the Galveston hurricane and the Klondike gold rush. I had printed fiction and poetry and advice for farmers and recipes for invalid cookery and advertisements for patent medicines that cured everything and cured nothing. All of this had passed through my hands and through my press, and I had absorbed portions of it, the way a man absorbs the weather he works in. It enters him, it affects him in small ways, but it does not fundamentally alter what he is. The Standard Oil articles were different. I was being changed by them. Not dramatically, not in any way that would have been visible to a man watching me work. I was still the same press operator, still arriving at 5:50 in the morning, still performing the same tasks with the same attention. But inside the work, inside the hours of the working day, something had shifted. I carried questions home that I had not previously carried. I thought about things on the elevated train that I had not previously thought about on the elevated train. I found myself, on more than one occasion, standing in my small kitchen on West 30th Street at 11 at night, eating a piece of bread over the counter because I had forgotten to eat properly, because I had been reading. The question that occupied me most in those autumn months was the question of what it meant to know something that other people did not yet know, because that was the strange position I was in. The articles had been appearing for nearly a year. People had been reading them. The circulation of the magazine had increased substantially since the series began, which was a subject of quiet satisfaction in the building, a satisfaction that reached even the press room in the form of longer runs and a production schedule that felt, week by week, slightly more weighted with importance. But each reader who encountered a new installment read it as a single, self-contained piece. They did not carry with them the previous 11 months the way I carried them. They did not read the December installment through the filter of November's discoveries, or January's, or February's. They began fresh each month. I did not begin fresh. I had been accumulating for a year. The accumulation had a weight to it. Not oppressive. It was not, for the most part, a distressing weight. It was more like the weight of a thing that is real in a way that other things are not quite real. The Standard Oil investigation had become, for me, more real than almost anything else I read about or thought about, because I had received it in the most physical way possible, as metal type, as ink, as paper, as the product of my own labor. I had made it with my hands, and what you make with your hands has a particular reality that ideas alone do not quite achieve. I want to say something about Mr. Rockefeller, because I spent a considerable amount of time that autumn thinking about him, and the thinking did not go where I expected it to go. I had not formed a simple opinion of him. This surprised me. The articles could have supported a simple opinion. The facts they presented were, in their outline, damning enough to sustain outrage without complication. But Tarbell's method was not the method of outrage. She presented what had happened and let the presentation speak. She did not tell you how to feel about John D. Rockefeller. She told you what John D. Rockefeller had done, with as much documentary precision as she could achieve, and left the feeling to you. And what I felt, arriving at it slowly through those autumn weeks, was something more uncomfortable than simple condemnation. I thought about Rockefeller as a man who had looked at an industry in chaos, which the oil industry was in the 1860s and 1870s, genuinely in chaos, with prices fluctuating wildly and refineries opening and failing, and the whole enterprise seeming, to a rational observer, more like gambling than commerce, and had decided to impose order on it. His order, certainly. Order that served his interests, unmistakably, but order nonetheless. He had seen that the problem of the oil business was overproduction and destructive competition, and he had solved that problem with extraordinary thoroughness. The solution had been ruthless. It had destroyed thousands of men's livelihoods and concentrated an historically unprecedented degree of economic power in a single organization. But as a solution to the specific problem it was designed to solve, it had worked. I thought, he is not wrong, exactly. Not within the system he built. And then I thought, that is perhaps the most frightening thing about him. A man who is wrong is understandable. A man who is right about everything except the most important thing. A man who solves the immediate problem with perfect efficiency while creating, in the process, a larger problem that no one yet has the tools to solve. That man is harder to hold in the mind. The system was the problem, not the man, or not only the man. The system that allowed one organization to achieve that degree of concentration, that degree of control over the prices paid by every household in the country for the fuel that lit and heated their homes. That system was the problem. And the system had not been designed to fail. It had simply not been designed to handle this. No one had imagined in 1870 that a thing this large was possible. I printed his name hundreds of times that autumn, on sample sheets and press proofs and the edges of forms I was checking for registration. John D. Rockefeller. The letters in their lead bodies, reversed and raised, ready to transfer. I am not sure I ever thought about any single person more carefully in my life. It was a Thursday afternoon in December of 1903, and the light through the press room windows had the particular quality of winter light in that room. Thin, slightly blue, arriving at a low angle that threw the machinery into a relief it didn't have in summer, making the presses look larger and more deliberate than usual, like things that knew what they were. I was running a short proofing pass on some corrected type when I noticed, across the room near the door that connected the press room to the main building, a woman I did not recognize. She was standing still, which was the first thing I noticed. People who came into the press room for the first time were usually in motion, moving carefully between machines, trying to look purposeful while in fact navigating unfamiliar terrain. This woman was standing still and looking at the press nearest the door with an attention that was not intimidated and not merely curious. It was the attention of someone who wanted to understand how something worked. Our pressroom superintendent, a large and unhurried man named Harris, who had been at McClure's longer than any of us, crossed the floor toward her. They spoke briefly. Then Harris turned and looked across the room, saw me, and lifted a hand. I left my station and walked over. "Reeves," Harris said, "this is Miss Tarbell. She's got a question about production timing." January of 1904. February. March. The articles had changed in the later installments, or rather my reading of them had changed, because the understanding I brought to them now was so much denser than what I had brought in October of 1902. The later pieces arrived into an intelligence already stocked with 15 months of accumulated detail, and so they landed with a different force. What had seemed in the early articles like careful groundwork, historical background, context setting, the patient establishment of a framework, was now revealed as precisely that, the ground on which these later pieces stood. Every specific case documented in the first 12 installments was now available as evidence for the arguments being made in the final ones. The word that appeared most frequently in the later articles, and that I found myself returning to as I pulled sample sheets, was monopoly. Tarbell used it the way a carpenter uses a level, not as a judgment, not as an accusation, but as a measurement. She was saying, Here is the word for the thing being described, and the thing being described fits this word. A monopoly is not a conspiracy, exactly, and it is not a crime, exactly, and it is not a moral failing, exactly. It is a condition that certain practices, sustained over time with sufficient resources and sufficient ruthlessness, produce. And this is what Standard Oil had produced, a condition. The final installments dealt with what that condition meant for the country as a whole, not just for the independent oil men of Pennsylvania, whose individual fates had been documented so carefully in the middle section of the series, but for the broader question of what kind of economy the United States was going to be. Whether the system of free competition that Americans professed to believe in, that was written into the mythology of the Republic, that Rockefeller himself had cited as his own justification, as the principle that had allowed him to outcompete his rivals, was in fact compatible with the kind of organization Standard Oil represented. Whether you could have free competition and a monopoly in the same economy without one eventually destroying the other. I thought about this while running press after press in the early months of 1904. It was an abstract question for a press operator. I had no standing in it. I was not a legislator or a judge or a man of capital. The decision about what to do with Standard Oil, if anything was to be done, would be made by men in rooms I would never enter, following processes I only dimly understood. But I had been printing the evidence for 15 months. I had read most of it, and the evidence seemed to me, as best I could judge, to be conclusive. There was a night run in February of 1904 that I've thought about often since. I had taken the shift as a favor to a man named Elkins, whose youngest child had scarlet fever and who needed to be home. The night shift was smaller, 3 men instead of the usual 8, and the building above us was empty, or nearly so. The editorial offices were dark, the composing room was locked. The whole structure above the press room had taken on the quality of a building in suspension, waiting, and we worked below it in a low hum of machinery and the occasional sound of a passing cart on the street outside. I was running the 3rd form of the February issue, and the Standard Oil pages were in it. By this point, I could identify the Standard Oil forms at a glance, something in the column density, in the particular regularity of the paragraphs, in the way long analytical prose looks different in type from fiction or reportage. I set the form, made my adjustments, ran my sample sheets. Then I stood at the press and read. What I was reading that night was a section of the penultimate installment that dealt with the question of what a monopoly does with itself after it is won. This was something I had been thinking about, in a less structured way, since my Saturday afternoons at the library. Tarbell was addressing it directly. Once Standard Oil had achieved its position, once the independent refiners had been absorbed or destroyed, and the railroad arrangements had been locked in place, and the price of refined oil was effectively set by one organization in New York, what happened next? The answer was, it continued. The monopoly did not stop at the point of victory. It extended into new territories. It found new industries, natural gas, iron ore, copper, banking, where the same advantages could be applied, the same methods used. It became, over time, something more than a company in any ordinary sense. It became, in a manner of speaking, a principle, the principle that sufficient capital and sufficient organization, applied with sufficient patience, could achieve a degree of control over any industry that rendered competition effectively impossible. Not illegal, not impossible in theory, simply impossible in practice, because the costs of competing against an entity that large, with the resources it commanded and the arrangements it had already locked in place, were costs that no ordinary enterprise could sustain. In March of 1904, I began to think about what would happen. I was a press operator. I was not a lawyer, not a senator, not a man with any standing in the institutions that would decide what happened next.
My understanding of the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, which I had encountered in the articles which had been passed specifically to prohibit the kind of arrangements Standard Oil had made, and which had been largely unenforced for 14 years, was the understanding of a citizen rather than a practitioner. But 15 months of reading Tarbell had given me, I thought, a reasonably clear picture of the logic. A public case is not a legal case, but a public case creates the conditions in which a legal case becomes possible. It creates the conditions in which prosecutors and attorneys general and presidents, who are also, in the end, political creatures, responsive to what the public knows and believes and demands, find themselves unable to ignore what previously they had been able to ignore. The public case, assembled and printed and distributed to 100,000 readers, 150,000 readers, changes the political landscape in which the legal case must be made. President Roosevelt had been making sounds about the trusts. I knew this from the papers and from the conversations that filtered down from the editorial floors. Whether those sounds would become something more substantial, actual prosecution, actual enforcement of the Sherman Act, was not something I could predict. Men in power make a great many sounds about great many things. The sounds do not always become actions. But the evidence was now public. That was what the press had done. The evidence was now in the hands of 150,000 readers, printed on pages that could not be unprinted, in an argument that could not be unassembled. Whatever happened or did not happen in the courts and the legislature and the executive branch, the public record existed. It would exist tomorrow and next year and in 20 years. The permanent record, as best I understood permanence, had been altered. I ran the press in March of 1904 thinking about permanence, about what it meant for something to become part of the record, about how, in the press room in the basement of a building on Park Place, that was what we did, every day, with every run. We made things permanent. We took what was true on one sheet and made it true on 10,000 sheets, identical, distributed, impossible to fully suppress. That was the work. The final installment came through in April of 1904. I knew it was the final one. The production schedule had indicated it, and the form itself, when it arrived from the composing room, had a different weight than the usual monthly installment. It was longer than any single installment had previously been, running across 2 full forms, with an appended section of documentary evidence that the compositors had taken particular care with. Tables of shipping rates, excerpts from corporate filings, a chronology of the major events of the previous 30 years assembled with the precision of a legal brief. The makeup men at the Stone had spent an additional day on the assembly. The compositors had run an extra set of galleys for checking. There was, in the building that week, a quality I can only describe as ceremony, unspoken, unacknowledged, but present in the slightly slower pace of each step, and the slightly more deliberate attention people gave to work they would have done quickly in any ordinary week. When the first form went on the press and the run began, I stood back for a moment and let myself see it. Not the form specifically, the whole of it. 19 months. That was how long the series had run, from the first installment in October's print run of 1902 to this final one in April of 1904. 19 months of the same subject arriving in my hands, month after month, building on what had come before, adding to the structure that had been building since the beginning. I pulled a sample sheet from the first form. I read, for the last time as a press operator reading copy as it came through, a section of Tarbell's conclusion. I will not try to reproduce what she wrote, because I could not reproduce it faithfully. My reading was still fragmentary, still interrupted by the work of the press, and in any case the words were hers, and I have no right to them. What I can tell you is the quality. The tone of the conclusion was not triumph. I had half expected something like triumph after 19 months of assembling a case that seemed to me conclusive, but the tone was something else. resolved in the musical sense, a tension that has found its proper note. Something that had been building for a long time, finding the place it had been moving toward. She was not celebrating. She was not dramatizing. She was simply completing the argument, with the same care and the same refusal of exaggeration with which she had begun it. I set the sample sheet down. I went back to running the press. Several days after the final run, I saw Lou Ferretti at the Stone. He was clearing down after the last form, stacking the galleys in their trays, doing the kind of orderly, end-of-job work that makeup men do. I had come through from the press room for no particular reason, or perhaps for this particular reason, without quite knowing it. "That's the end of it," I said. Lou looked up. He didn't ask what I meant. "About time," he said, which from Lou meant he was sorry it was over. We stood there in the way that working men stand when something is ended, and neither of them is quite sure what to do with the ending, not quite looking at each other, half attending to the tasks at hand. "You think anything will happen?" Lou said after a while. "With the company, with Rockefeller?" It was the first time either of us had put the question directly in all the months we had been talking around the edges of it. I thought about how to answer. "I think something already happened," I said. Lou was quiet, waiting. "The printing, the articles, that's already happened. You can't unprint it." I was looking at the Stone, at the marks left by a year and a half of forms. 150,000 people know what the system was, maybe more. The articles got reprinted, discussed in other papers. That's already done. Whatever happens in the courts happens on top of that. The ground is already different. Lou nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "My father used to say, the thing you can't fix is when the story gets out." He set down the tray he was holding. He meant it as a warning, usually, about gossip, about saying things you shouldn't say. A pause. "But I suppose it works the other way, too." "It works the other way," I said. We stood there a moment longer. Then Lou went back to clearing down the Stone, and I went back to the press room, and that was the last time we spoke directly about the articles. We went on eating lunch together at the sandwich counter on Barclay Street for several more years, and we talked about baseball and the elevated railway and Tammany Hall, and the usual business of two working men in a city that was always changing faster than either of them quite kept pace with. We did not speak about Tarbell again. There was nothing left to say about it that hadn't been said between us in the language available to men like us. The story was out. That was enough. I want to tell you what I learned from those 19 months. Not the history. You can read that if you want it. The book came out in the autumn of 1904, both volumes, and it was reviewed extensively and read widely and debated in the places where such things are debated. The Roosevelt administration brought suit against Standard Oil under the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1906, citing evidence that bore a strong resemblance to the evidence that had been appearing in McClure's for the previous 4 years. And in May of 1911, 7 years after the final installment ran through my press, the Supreme Court of the United States ordered the dissolution of the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey into 34 separate companies. The monopoly that had spent 40 years assembling itself was, by order of law, disassembled. I was still at McClure's in 1911. By then I was pressroom superintendent rather than press operator, and I had more of the building than the press room in my purview, and I knew the editors by name, even if I didn't know them well. Harris told me the news of the Supreme Court decision on the morning it came down, having come downstairs specifically for that purpose. I thanked him and went back to overseeing a press run. But I thought about November of 1902 for the rest of that morning, about a sample sheet with slightly off registration on the right margin, about a name catching in my attention like a snag in cloth. What I learned is this: the work of truth is not the work of a single moment. It does not arrive whole. It does not strike like revelation, sudden, total, transformative. It arrives the way a long press run arrives, sheet by sheet, impression by impression, each one identical to the last and to the next. The same words reproduced 10,000 times until the reproduction is complete. It arrives through repetition and accumulation and the patient work of making one thing into many things without losing what the one thing was. I ran the press. That was my work. I made sure the ink was correctly mixed and the paper fed straight, and the impression was consistent from the first sheet to the last, so that what was true on copy number 1 was still true, still legible, still sharp on copy number 10,000. Consistency was the craft. Fidelity to the original was the craft. Making sure that the thing said was the thing received, by everyone who received it, without distortion or loss. And somewhere in that work, in 19 months of press runs and sample sheets and registration checks, and the long meditative hours of a machine in full run, I understood that I was part of something. Not the main part, not the important part in the sense of the part that would be remembered. The part that would be remembered was upstairs, making the argument, gathering the evidence, writing the sentences. That was the important part, and I had no claim to it. But I was a part, a necessary part, the part without which the words remained private, confined to one office, one manuscript, one copy that could be lost or burned or simply never distributed. The part that made the private thing public. The part that took one and made 10,000. The part that made it permanent, in the only sense that permanence is available to us, beyond the reach of any single person's power to suppress it. Print makes things permanent. Not forever. Nothing is forever. But permanent in the sense that matters. Permanent past the moment of any particular person's decision to hide or destroy. Permanent into the record. Permanent into the knowledge that is available to the next person who thinks to look. That is what a press does. That is what I did. I ran the press, sheet by sheet, 19 months. The story got out. In the week after the final run went out, I walked home by a different route. I don't know why I chose it. Sometimes you take a different street for no reason you could name, and it turns out to be the one you needed. I went down Fulton Street, past the block where the small printer had been, the first one I had worked for, the one where I had swept floors at 17 and first understood that the smell of ink was the smell I was going to spend my life around. The building was still there, still a printing operation, though different hands ran it now. I could hear the sound of a press through the wall, a sound I knew the way I knew my own heartbeat. The same fundamental rhythm, the same breathing quality, the same low and patient percussion of paper meeting ink, meeting pressure, meeting paper. I stood on the sidewalk and listened for a while. It was April. The street smelled of the particular spring of Lower Manhattan, fresh air trying to assert itself over the accumulated winter of the city, winning here and losing there, the two in negotiation. A delivery wagon went past, heavy with rolls of newsprint going to one of the papers on Park Row. The driver did not look at me. I thought about what it means to do one thing for a long time. To become the kind of person who knows one process so well that the process has become part of your body. Who can hear a machine and know in 2 seconds what it is saying. Who can look at a sample sheet and know in 1 second whether the impression is right. Who can feel in the soles of their feet, through the floor, whether the press is running as it should. That kind of knowledge is a particular thing. It doesn't make you important. It doesn't give you standing. It doesn't put you in the histories. But it is real in a way that other kinds of knowledge are not quite real, because it lives in the hands and the feet and the ears as well as in the mind. I had spent 19 months printing the truth about Standard Oil. I had not written it. I had not gathered it. I had not understood all of it, in the full sense that a reader with time and attention and an education in the law might understand it. I had encountered it in fragments, and I had carried the fragments home, and I had assembled from those fragments an understanding that was incomplete, but was, I believed, not wrong in its essentials. And I had made it permanent. That was the thing I stood on Fulton Street thinking about, in April of 1904, with a press running behind the wall beside me, and the spring air negotiating with the winter of the city around me. I had made it permanent. Not I alone. There were compositors and makeup men and pressmen and binders and delivery drivers and distribution clerks and all the others who had touched the work as it moved from thought to object to distributed thing. But I had been part of that chain. I had been one necessary link. The delivery wagon turned the corner onto Park Row and disappeared. The press behind the wall continued its patient work. I walked home through the April evening. The city was loud with its usual conversation, elevated trains and horses and the distant sound of construction on a block to the west, and the voices of people who had finished their work and were moving through the streets in that particular Friday evening quality of motion that said the week was done and the next one had not yet begun. I walked through all of it thinking about ink and paper and the 19 months just completed, and the man upstate in Pennsylvania who had sold a refinery in 1878 for a third of what it was worth, and never explained why, and died in 1894 with the explanation still inside him. He would have been in his 70s now if he had lived. Perhaps he would have read the articles. Perhaps he would have sat in a reading room somewhere with a copy of McClure's and found in those columns the explanation he had never given and that no one had given him. Perhaps he would have understood, reading it, that he had not failed, that the ground had been made impossible before he stood on it, that his silence was not shame, but simply the absence of language for something that had not yet been named. The name had been given now. The thing had been named. It was in print, in 150,000 copies, in the permanent record. I walked home. I ate my supper. I sat by the window with the fig tree in the courtyard outside, already coming into leaf in the April warmth, and I read until the light was gone. Then I put out the lamp, and I let the night come in, and I slept.